Hello, my name is Noah Ray. I'm going to be discussing 10 different logical fallacies today with you guys. And so let's jump right in. Our first logical fallacy that we'll be discussing today is begging the question. Begging the question is essentially presenting an argument in such a way that it can't help but be true, even though no evidence has been presented. My example for this is capitalism is 100% good because we don't get to own things. The person in our example is stating that capitalism is always good without really providing any evidence for that other than we get to own things, which is not a lot of evidence. The second logical fallacy that I'm going to be going over is an ad hominem or an ad hominem attack. This is essentially where a speaker will attack another person instead of presenting evidence or ideas to support the argument. The example that I'm using for this one is we cannot accept Joseph's arguments as he owes $10,000 in back taxes. The person in our example is discrediting his opponent, Joseph, and bringing up the fact that he owes $10,000 in back taxes instead of addressing the topic that they're discussing. Number 3 is bandwagoning. The definition for this is basing an argument on general opinion as a basis for asserting something as the truth. My example for this is LeBron James is the best basketball player because everyone likes him. The person in our example is claiming that LeBron James is the best basketball player based on public perception rather than statistics or just any other real evidence that he's better than other NBA players. The next one is the either or fallacy. This fallacy is essentially presenting an argument as though there are only two options, despite potentially having more outcomes. The example that I'm using for this one is our speaker saying we have to vote for Joe Biden so Trump does not win. He is completely ignoring the fact that there are other people that you could vote for. Essentially saying that if you don't vote for Joe Biden, Trump will win, when there are other options. Number 5 is the red herring. This is essentially introducing an irrelevant piece of information or just taking attention away from the topic at hand. The example I'm using for this one is, though climate change is becoming more and more apparent, we must recognize that minimum wage is not a livable wage. The person in our example is taking attention away from the initial topic of climate change and instead trying to get people to think about minimum wage instead. Number 6 is a hasty generalization. The definition for this fallacy is an argument that uses an isolated instance to make unwarranted general conclusion. The example that I'm using for this is League of Legends players are often rude to their teammates, so that must mean all gamers are rude people. In this example, the person has had a bad experience with some of their teammates on a game called League of Legends, and now they are coming to the conclusion that all gamers must be rude people based on this one experience. Number 7 is a faulty analogy. This is when one makes a claim that two phenomena are alike when, in fact, they are not similar enough to warrant a comparison. The example I'm using for this is cutting down trees to produce lumber is like starting a forest fire. While cutting down trees and forest fires both do produce both destroy forests, neither are similar enough to be compared like this, as cutting down trees actually produces something, whereas forest fires just destroy things for the sake of destruction. Moving on to number 8 is the non sequitur argument, or yeah. The definition for this is an argument which the conclusion does not follow from the evidence. My example for the non sequitur fallacy is, because he is riding a skateboard, he must be able to do an ollie. This is a non sequitur, as you cannot assume that because someone's riding a skateboard, they can do an ollie or any other kind of trick. Because some people just ride skateboards, they don't do any tricks. I'm like that. I can't do any tricks on a skateboard, but I do enjoy riding them. Next we have the slippery slope argument. It's essentially making an assumption that since one thing happens, it will lead to a series of events or actions that leads to a completely different scenario. My example for this one is, providing participation trophies will create a generation that is unmotivated and lazy. The person in our example is saying that if you give kids participation trophies at like a sporting event or like a game, that they will grow up to be unmotivated and or lazy, despite there not being any real evidence to support that claim. And lastly, we have an appeal to tradition. An appeal to tradition is making an argument based on acceptance of historical traditions, despite historical traditions not always necessarily being morally acceptable. My example for this is, the man should be the breadwinner of the house because that is how families traditionally work. While it is true that in older times, the man typically was the breadwinner for the house, as time has progressed, women have become more financially liberated and have been able to have more job opportunities and been able to just make better lives for themselves. And that is why you cannot always go by historical traditions, because things change and society evolves over time. And my last slide is just my citations. I got all of this information from pages 186 to 187 in A Pocket Guide to Public Speaking by Dan O'Hare and Hannah Rubenstein and a few more. Thank you for listening. I hope you guys have a good night.